Once again, it's Michael James with another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. And we have a pretty exciting show today. We're only going to have one guest because there's a lot to talk about. We're going to meet with a woman named Kathleen Osberger, and she has a new book out called I Surrender. It's a memoir of Chile's dictatorship back in 1975. Before we get started, a couple things. I did take a fall, so you'll notice a big bruise on my head, but I'm all right. I was checked out at the St. Francis Hospital. And I do want to remind people that coming up on the 30th, which is this coming Thursday after the show starts on Friday, there's going to be a citywide memorial for the Reverend Walter Slim Coleman, longtime activist who recently passed away. And that memorial from 6 to 8 at the Rainbow Push headquarters, 930 East 50th Street. May 30th, 6 to 8, Rainbow Push, 930 East 50th Street. And I would like to alert you all that it's time for our first fundraiser in many years, since before the pandemic. We produce this show now for over 20 years. Every week we have interesting guests and good conversation. And we do pay our engineer. So we are about to send you an email, all of you who are signed up to our site, that we are doing a fundraiser and we are requesting a little money, and we do have some gifts for you in return, including my latest book, Rising Up Angry, Our Fight for a Better World. Okay. I think we're going to leave it at that rather than me rambling on. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to be back with our guest, and we're going to talk about what it was like living with a number of sisters in a house in Santiago, Chile during the Pinochet coup years. Be right back. Once again, it's Michael James. I'm here ready to start this week's show. This is for the week of May 25th, and we are recording it a few days earlier. Our guest today is Kathleen Osberger, and I got to know about her through Maria Ovalle, who sent me an email when Kathy was doing a book reading. She has a new book out called I Surrender, a memoir of Chile's dictatorship, 1975. And it's a good read. And for those of us who follow world politics, we know that there had been a coup in Chile years back, 1973, I think.
Correct.
And for me, I remember driving up to Schurz High School on that day to sell Rising Up Angries when I heard the news that Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president of Chile, had been overthrown in a coup led by Augusto Pinochet. I think the coup is called golpe, or the fist, or the punch. And, I think this was organized a lot by Chile's ruling class, probably in collaboration with the United States. But we're going to find out more from someone who was there shortly thereafter, the one and only Kathleen Osberger. And good day to you, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Michael, for having me on. And I'm just delighted to be able to speak to you and your guest, and very happy to share this story. You mentioned the coup. The coup happened on September 11th, 1973. But I could give a little bit of background of what led up to the coup.
I was going to ask you, tell us a little bit about where you come from, and then we'll go into how you ended up in Chile.
Okay. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, a town about 90 miles away from Chicago. And some of the influences of me in my early childhood were meeting a Nicaraguan family who I was their babysitter. I was 12 years old, and this family lived in our neighborhood and had 7 kids between ages of 2 and 10, with a set of twins in there. I was 12, and there were 7 of them. So I just loved to go to this family's house because they spoke Spanish, and no one in my neighborhood spoke a different language that I knew of. Although there was some diversity in the neighborhood, very few people spoke a different language. And I got to know this family well, and they wanted to tell me a lot about, when I was curious as a 12-year-old, asking them about Nicaragua and their lives. And it was just interesting. The father did not want to, he had studied at Notre Dame as an architect, and he brought his wife up to the United States after he graduated. He could have gone home and had a very high level practice in Nicaragua, but he refused to be under the thumb of the Somoza dictatorship. He knew every project would lead to the control by the 40-year dynasty of the Somozas. So those are like little things that I learned about as a child. I studied at St. Joe High School, had a great religious brother, a Puerto Rican, who taught me Spanish and taught me something important. He said, to learn another language is to love another soul. And so we were going to have to love the soul of the language. And he really brought us forward. And I feel like those were a couple of things in my life that were definitely invisible passports to a future I didn't know about.
Well, in 1975, when you were 22 and had just graduated from Notre Dame, you jumped at an opportunity to be a volunteer teacher at a Maryknoll grade school in Santiago, Chile. And I'm curious to know what influences led you to make that decision.
Well, on the campus of Notre Dame, I was with the first group of women. So there were only 365 of us undergraduates between 4 classes. So that was a very challenging time. But also on the campus at that time was very strong social justice movement of students and also faculty members who were building courses to help expose us to a lot of the structural issues internationally. And so I gravitated both to those experiences, which allowed me, one of them allowed me to go to Madrid, and the second one allowed me to go to San Miguelito, Panama in the 1974 summer. And as probably most of your audience will remember, if they're of a certain age like me, but if not, I'd like to say at that time in Latin America, there was a very profound shift going on. The very poor people were migrating from the poor rural areas and coastal areas towards the regional cities as well as the capital cities. And there they were just taking over land because they had so much need for building housing and having a new place and to be closer to work resources. And that was true in San Miguelito at that time, the summer of 74. And there I saw a very interesting project, which was, and lived with a family and saw what the Catholic Church was doing in San Miguelito. And of note, it was led by the Chicago Diocese and some very prominent people, Father Leo Mann, Father Don Headley, who some people may know from the north side. They both were priests here at different times, and the famous John Wancho Donahue, the head of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, were priests leading this mission. And this mission was serving what were tens of thousands of poor people migrating in, no water, no sewage, no electricity. And the church there was thinking about how are we going to serve all these people? And they started building up lay leadership to form what later became known as the first Christian-based communities. And those communities then spread throughout Latin America, that methodology, and was really part of helping lift up the poor and their voice of the poor and the struggles that were to come in Latin America. All of that was very prominent for me. It was like a click. I understood now how my faith could result in justice and transformation. So it was very, very important to me. And the opportunity to go to Chile grew out of that.
Then you took a Tika bus, as I recall reading.
Oh, yes. Yes, I was, what do they call it? The Tika bus. The Tika bus ran from Mexico City. So that I was with a couple of Notre Dame students that we went down to Chile. Others later joined us, but we decided that we would, I don't think we really looked at a map, but we decided we're going to get to Chile from Mexico City by taking Tika bus all the way through to Panama City. And back then, the Tika bus was a throwaway bus from the South, the Greyhound bus, like the most beat up Greyhound bus that you could sell and resell, was sent to Central America. And this was considered the deluxe bus. And none of the windows closed. The curtains were full of dust. The the drawstring curtains. It looked like something out of, the 40s and movies in the South. So, but it was a great trip. We paid a few pennies more for each of our journeys, and we stopped in each of the capitals of Central America on our way down, and had a lot of adventures. One of the most memorable ones was when a pack of rats dove into a plastic bag of bread that we had hanging off one of our bedposts, because we had a 4 a.m. departure. And so we had bought food the night before, and the rats were then in our beds, and we were like jumping around and screaming. But we made it out alive.
Well, I remember taking a Tica bus from Nicaragua, from Managua, down to Costa Rica after the Sandinistas had lost the election.
Uh-huh.
It was a pretty nice ride. But so you arrive in Santiago, Chile, and you're going to teach school for a couple years. And what's it called? It's like the SSND. It's the Society of Sisters Notre Dame, or
Yes. So these were religious sisters, actually from the East Coast, that also had the similar name to my university, Notre Dame, but they were called. Worked in Chile. The reason I went to Chile were Holy Cross priests who lead the University of Notre Dame in South Bend. Had for several decades, they had a mission there in Chile, and they built up a very prominent grade school from kindergarten to 12th grade. And the sisters were joining, the school sisters of Notre Dame were joining them in this enterprise. At that time, the school in Santiago, known as St. George College, it was called, and it was a school that was undergoing a big transformation. They were looking at the situation as was happening in Latin America in Catholic circles. They were looking at the social reality and saying, what are we doing here in our country, in our countries? And the bishops, after Vatican II, were told to get together within their continent, and identify how they were going to respond to the signs of the times. And the Latin American bishops met in Medellin, Colombia in 1968, which, as we all know, was a radical time, both in the United States and in Latin America, with burgeoning socialist movements and populist movements. And the bishop said, what are we doing? We've been aligning ourselves all these centuries with the wealthy class and their rule. And yet the signs of the times are vast poverty and need. And so that came out, kind of the phrase is dedicating the pastoral work as an option for the poor.
Kathy, let me ask you, it was a time of significant change in the Catholic Church, particularly in Latin America, somewhat in the United States. Can you let our listeners and our viewers know what was the situation under Allende, who was overthrown by the golpe or the coup led by Pinochet, and what was it like under Pinochet when you showed up? And then I want to learn, and the key here is you learned the secret.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So, and President Allende was a very well-known politician. Well, when he became president, of course, he was well-known, but he had run about 4 times for high political office. So he was a trained physician and practicing physician. He was also a cabinet minister in various governments previous, and he was also a senator. So he was very well known to the public, but he was known because he was looking for a change that could come about for Latin American countries. And he thought that the socialist model was the best economic model, because it would share the greater part of the wealth that was being produced in the country. But at that time, the corporate elites inside of Chile and the big multinationals working in Chile, the multinationals loved to work in Chile because Chile had 130-year unbroken democracy at the time up until 1973 when the coup happened. So Chile was a very stable government, And that's why a lot of corporations like to go there, because there was predictability in the governance and less instability politically. So it was a well-fought election. It took place in October, I think September, October of 1973 or 1970. Allende was actually running again for president. And he won in a three-way, very tight race, each three-way tie almost. But the tradition in Chile was if there was a tie, then the the candidate who received the highest amount of votes was then sworn in by the government. Well, in that little interim between the time where he was actually, the vote was known, the Congress was going to vote the next month, October, for him. In that interim, the coup already took place. The head of the major newspaper media company was headed up by Augustine Edwards. And Edwards and the head of PepsiCo Corporation came up, and through meeting with Henry Kissinger, who was then the security advisor, national security advisor to the president, who was then Richard Nixon, and they immediately got an appointment with Richard Nixon, and they began to plan the coup, because Nixon was afraid that if Chile went socialistic, so-called, then all the other countries in Latin America would follow that model and not follow the U.S. model that was being pushed. Actually, Allende, he did not believe in, he wanted to win the election through the democratic process. He did not want an armed revolution. And so he was very clear about that. I was not there until 1975, which would have been 2 years after the coup. So I can't speak except what I have read historically. Initially, it started off pretty well. There was a lot of excitement, but also the secret planning behind the coup was happening. And there were all these attempts by the United States government to destabilize the country economically. In fact, Nixon gave orders saying, make the economy scream. He had a secret memo that had all the top CIA operatives that were needed to work to destabilize the country. And most importantly, they wanted to remove Allende before he even got affirmed by the Congress in the vote. They did not succeed in that, but they did succeed in destabilizing the country economically. And then the AFL-CIO also participated in major transportation strikes that strangled the arrival of food into the city. So it turned out to be a very chaotic time, but also a hopeful time. But unfortunately, on September 11, 1973, that is when the bombing started from Valparaiso, where the U.S. naval equipment was placed, and reportedly all of the communications about the planes, where they were flying, how they were going to bomb Moneda Palace, and who they were going to take prisoners, etc., were being coordinated off of that base after one of the U.S. boats at Valparaiso.
I did find it interesting. I remember when there was the trucker strike, and in your book, you talk about how there were no goods. They've really tightened it up, so people were starting to grumble. Of course, as soon as the coup happened, everything got released. There was lots of food, particularly for the wealthier, I'm sure. Let's jump to in this first half of our interview to what you found out when you moved into this house with the SSND people, the convent.
So I was one, and there were three religious sisters. I'll mention their names because they're very pivotal in the story. Sister Paula Armstrong, Sister Helen Nelson, and Sister Bernadette Ballasty. And there were also two other laywomen like myself who were not religious sisters living in the house. One was a Chilean, Isabel Donoso, and the other was Rosita Arroyo. So I was brought into this house, and the day that I arrived, Sister Bernadette met me at the airport. We drove through the city. It was a very rainy, dreary, cold day because when I arrived, it was the end of July of 1975, and that's Chilean winter and our summer. So we go to the house, and it was a very modest house. It was like a street of attached row houses made out of cement. There were 5 bedrooms in the house, and there's a little teeny garden, interior patio, a kitchen, living room, dining room. No heat, except through a little portable heater, but very comfortable. And the sisters had it, enough blankets and that kind of thing. So we were always comfortable. But on the day I arrived, Sister Bernadette brought me into the house, showed me the different rooms in the house, and we went to the kitchen, and we were making some toast and some coffee. And as she sat down to talk to me and orient me a little bit, she said, her voice started to quiver, and she seemed very anxious. And she said, "Well, Kathy, the others have asked me not to tell you about this right away, but we hide people here whose lives are in danger and who are being sought by the secret police, the DINA." And the DINA was the Directorate of National Intelligence. It would be like our CIA or FBI. And it was a clandestine group at that moment. Later in the year, through the issues that I'll be talking about from my book, it became a very well-known and very public hit squad that operated during the evening curfew hours.
Let me, so you find out that they hide people out. And the next thing which I think we should share is what happened in a town called Maloco, which
Mayoko.
in my primitive Spanish is, if you separate the word, it's crazy
Maloco.
bad.
Yeah, so it's Mayoko. It's spelled like the 2 L's sound like a Y. But anyway,
Yep.
I was teaching in a grade school for the first few weeks, and the instance of a confrontation in Mayoko occurred about 10 weeks into my stay. And so that particular day, I was walking down after school. I went downtown to do some errands, and I was feeling kind of confident. I was feeling like, wow, I've been here a few weeks, and I'm starting to get to know people, and someone's invited me to a little meet afterwards after work and talk. And they were showing me around to some of the sites in the city. And so I was feeling like I was beginning to fit in. And that day, as I walked down this major street called La Alameda, a news vendor was shouting out the evening news. And he was shouting out the night's headline. In Chile, they had morning papers and evening papers. And so newspapers. And so as I walked down, I heard this man shouting out, "Mayoko, there's been a shootout in Mayoko." And pretty soon, everyone on the block who was walking by started to slow down, and they were listening as he shouted the headline out 2 and 3 times. And he said, "One member of the MIR was killed." The MIR was the revolutionary leftist movement, Movimiento Izquierdista Revolucionaria. And 2 DINA have been injured. 2 secret police were injured. What was happening at that moment was that the police basically fell upon the hideout, the farm, an abandoned farm, what appeared to be an abandoned farm hideout, where the top leadership of the MIR, the leftist movement, were meeting. There, about 13 of their members were in this farmhouse when the secret police pulled up, and their lookout started firing. And then, of course, the leftists all were firing back, and the secret police were firing at them. But it was almost at nightfall that it occurred. So it turned dark, and they were out in this big farmland. And somehow all of the MIR people, except for the person who was the lookout, Dagoberto Perez, he was killed in the shootout. But all the rest of them were able to flee into the nearby fields. And I think they had like little dugouts, hideaways, in the field, maybe with a few little supplies. But one of the couple was Andrés Pascal Allende. And Andrés Pascal Allende, as you can hear from the last name, he was a relative. He was the nephew of Salvador Allende, and he was the head of this leftist movement, armed movement. And that was Pinochet's #1 target, was to take him down. From the time of the coup, okay.
I was going to say, we're going to take a short musical break and
Okay.
station ID, and then we're coming right back, and you're going to talk to us a little bit about how a couple of the people who were involved in the shoot up end up at your house.
Okay,
All right. We'll be right
sounds
back.
good.
Welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of May 25th with our guest today, who has written a book called I Surrender, a memoir of Chile's dictatorship, 1975. Hello again, Kathleen Osberger. Before we took a break, you were talking about the shootout in Mayoko and
Yes.
how most of the people escaped. One of the revolutionary MIR members had been killed. The secret police type people are really up in arms about this. And a couple of these people who escaped end up at the convent.
So as they fled to the fields, one of the persons, number two in command, Nelson Gutierrez, and his wife, Maria Elena Bachman, ran through the fields. They had a 9-month-old baby daughter in their arms. So they were being fired at, holding their child. They hid out for a couple of days in those fields. And then they made a break. They hijacked a few cars and were able to come into Santiago because they were about 30 miles away from the capital city. Once they were inside of Santiago, they were seeking out people who helped them. Usually they would have gone to their own safe houses of Mir, but all of those had been abandoned by that time because the secret police was targeting all of those people. So who could they go to? They went to some clergy members that they knew about. And in this case, they went to Father Geraldo Whelan. And Father Whelan helped Andres Pascal Allende to go and stay in one of the Holy Cross priests' house. And then they were looking, some Jesuit priests, Father Carriola and Salas, were very committed to human rights. And everyone knew that if these people were found, they were just going to be killed outright or savagely tortured and then killed. And so the church people took the position of, it's our responsibility to first save a life and worry about the politics later. So they did ask the SSND sisters, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, where I lived, could they hide one person? But on the night of October 20th, while there was a birthday party going on at our house, at the convent house, for Sister Helen Nelson, 3 of the top 4 militants ended up being clandestinely brought into the house in our safekeeping. And you can only imagine how dangerous that was to have the very top people being targeted by Pinochet, who never feared to make orders to torture and kill. So in the next few days, the biggest problem was that Nelson Gutierrez had bullet wounds in his legs, and they were festering, and he was potentially going to die if they could not be operated on, but you could not take a person to a hospital. So they asked, a clandestine medical visit took place, and Dr. Sheila Cassidy, a British citizen, came to the house and attempted to remove the bullets in his legs that were turning into sepsis. But she couldn't remove them, and she came out and told the priest, look, you have to get them into an embassy, because in an embassy, they could put together the medical equipment, the sterile equipment, and the surgical equipment necessary to be able to operate. And she said, if you don't give him attention soon, he will probably die in the convent.
So what happens next, as I recall in reading the book, is it's a Peugeot, and the Vatican consulate is the destination. Tell us about the escape from the convent to the Vatican, the Vatican, what do you call it?
Vatican embassy. That it was called the Nunciatura in Spanish, but it's the Vatican embassy in Santiago. So yes, I have to say, all these people, they had been in this struggle since 1973. So we're in the middle of we're 3/4 into 1975 at this point, pretty much. And so the sisters had housed about 14 different cases. But this was a case of a different level, because they were told to come in, that they could be protected in these safe houses of the religious, but you had to say no weapons. You couldn't bring in your weapons. But as a matter of fact, they were bringing in their weapons, and they were found on multiple occasions, and they had to be thrown out. But nonetheless, the nuns and the priests were carrying and trying to save their lives. And Father, they did the priests went out and looked for an embassy that would take them, and all the embassies said no, they would not take them. Then they went and spoke with the papal nuncio, and he was actually a Spaniard, a priest, a Spaniard from Spain who supported Franco. He was on the right wing. But nevertheless, he saw that these people would be killed, and also that there would be probably tragedy for anyone who helped them. So he agreed to take them into his house. He took Nelson Gutierrez and his wife, Maria Elena Bachman, into his house. And the way they were transported there was Father Whalen and Salas and Carriola borrowed the sister's car, came to the house through a back entryway, took them out into the garage, and told this wounded man and his wife, jump into the trunk of the car. And then in the middle of the day, they were, in the busiest part of the day, they were taken through a very, very popular upper class neighborhood where, of course, the embassies would be located. And with a lot of apprehension, they were driving, hoping they would not be detected. And as they pulled onto the street, this one-way street where the embassy was, right at that moment, a car came up the street the wrong way. It was a one-way street. And luckily, all of the guards got distracted and they ran into the street to move the car away. And at that moment, Father Whalen hit the pedal and he was able to go into the embassy gates and go behind, and they were brought into the embassy. And to my knowledge, they spent the next 9 months there. I mentioned that they Nelson and Maria Elena Bachman, they had this 4-month-old child, but at the moment that they had fled in the fields, the morning that they fled in the fields back in Mayoko, as they ran through the fields, a peasant woman came out and said to them, "Compañeros, le puedo ayudar, my friends, can I help you?" And Maria Elena gave her baby girl to the lady. And then they tried to find safe houses and eventually got into the embassy. I learned later that the child was actually taken care of in the home of a sister of one of the most prominent priests in Chile, the head of the Committee for Peace, which later became known as the Vicariate of Solidarity. It was the human rights and humanitarian group. And at great risk, he asked his sister, would she please care for this baby? Because the baby was also being sought by Pinochet. And yet his sister had 3 boys under 10 years of age, but she said yes, and she cared for the baby for 9 months before it could be arranged for the baby to be reunited with the family.
So what happens next, as I recall, was the Directorate of National Intelligence, or the DINA. They came to the convent, and they had been looking for Dr. Sheila Cassidy, this doctor who had worked on one of the Mir people who had been staying there. You ended up being taken by them, and you had to do some fibbing, big time. And you tell us a little bit about what happened when the DINA came and who was apparently in charge of the DINA. I think a fellow named Michael Townley.
Yes, very. So on November 1st and 2nd, I went over to the Colombian Father's house, and that's where a friend of mine, a sister who I worked with at the school, had been sick, and Dr. Cassidy, as it turned out, was caring for her. So that day I met Dr. Cassidy. I spent some time with Sister Connie Kelly, and also we spent some time with the maid of the house, Enriqueta Reyes Valerio. And we had a very nice day, and there was a birthday cake for Connie because it was her birthday. So I spent a great deal of time there that day, leaving at dusk. And as I left at dusk, when I went out on the street, a car immediately came zipping up the street, weaving and flashing its lights at me. And I got to the other side and I thought, is that car aiming at me? And then I heard a car door snap, and a man got out, and he was following me. And I was getting on and off buses, hoping to get him off my tail. And fortuitously, I was able to do that eventually. And I ran, when I got off the bus and he got trapped inside of it, I ran through the streets back to the house where the sisters were. We were all very apprehensive because we knew that no one, so far as we knew, no one had been picked up. They were still looking for whoever helped them. And certainly they were getting information. By the next morning, at dawn the next morning, or well before dawn the next morning, secret police arrived at our door. And they were looking for Sister Helen Nelson, who very fortunately was not at home because she would have been taken and brutally treated. And so they began to interrogate all of us. And first, Sister Paula was taken up to be spoken to, and then I was sent up to be spoken to by this man. And we were in the dining room area, and there was an open phone. He had opened up the phone. He had it sitting on the ottoman. And I could tell that he was communicating with someone somewhere else. And I suspected that it was probably Dr. Cassidy, that probably those people I saw on the street as I left the Columban house the night before were actually secret police beginning a raid. And it turned out that that was so. And that just as I left that house, minutes after I left that house, Enriqueta Reyes was assassinated by the strafing of the building by the secret police. And overnight, they were getting more information. They came to our house. They were looking for Sister Helen Nelson. And instead, I'm being interrogated by this person, and I'm looking at him thinking, is this person? He had a very familiar feel to me. And he was dressed in blue jeans and a Levi vest. He had a weapon with him. Of course, there are a lot of other men with machine guns already in the house circulating around me. And he started questioning me. And he had blue eyes, light hair, light skin, very tall and slender, extremely tall and slender by Chilean standards. And I'm like, who is this? And when he began to ask me questions, he started asking me some in English. And I realized this guy is from the Midwest because I heard his voice. And I'm like, what? This is a US agent inside of the secret police running these raids? Well, he did 3 or 4 raids that night. The Columban house, convent where I was, where they took me prisoner. The Holy Cross priest house, and their seminary house. And in each places they took people prisoners. When they took me prisoner, they blindfolded me. They put me in their car, the Fiat car, and they drove crazily through the streets. And they took me, and I had to suppose that I was at a very famous, infamous torture center called Via Grimaldi. And inside, I intuited that Dr. Cassidy was there, and that was the place from where the communications were happening, where they were sending orders to the man that I called the American commander because of his physique and his voice. Well, it turns out that he was a well-known hitman, and he led the hits ordered by Pinochet on 3 very prominent people. The first one was in Argentina in 1974 at the home of Carlos Prats. Carlos Prats was the second in command in the Chilean army, and he resisted the efforts of the US and other people to try and make the military become part of the coup attempt. He was resisting that. He believed that it was the responsibility of the army to live up to its oath and the Constitution. And for that, the first general, Rene Schneider, who also believed that, he was killed. Carlos Prat had to flee to Argentina, and a year later, a car bomb was built and placed under his car. And when he and his wife came back from a gathering, and they pulled their car into their carport, the car was detonated, and they were immediately incinerated. But the person pressing the button across the street, seated with his wife in the car in Buenos Aires, was Michael Townley. Michael Townley then in 1975 also hired a hitman to try and kill a prominent Chilean diplomat or a leader whose name was Bernardo Leithen in Rome of 1975. Fortunately, the hitman who was hired I shouldn't say only, but they stayed alive. He and his wife who were walking home to their apartment near the Vatican, and they ended up having lifelong injuries. Leighton had a bullet to his head, and his wife, her spine was nicked so that she was a paraplegic for the rest of her life. And the third one that probably most of your audience would know about was the 1976 assassination on Embassy Row on September 21st, 1976. And the person they were targeting that day was Orlando Letelier, the former Chilean ambassador to the United States under Salvador Allende. He was a diplomat. He was a very charismatic person, very well known in the U.S. Washington, D.C. Corps, and very well liked. And he was still speaking out against, in 1976, he was still speaking out against Pinochet. He himself had been over 2 years in the terrible clandestine torture centers and also in the concentration camps in the north and the south of Chile, and eventually was let out, and he reunited with his family in DC. And he was going to work that day at the Institute for Policy Studies, which I think a lot of us probably have read books and reports from the Institute for Policy Studies. And on his way in, two of his colleagues said, "Hey, our car broke down. Can we ride in with you tomorrow?" And unfortunately, in his car was Ronnie Carpen Moffett and her husband, Michael Moffett, and Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Carpen Moffett were both assassinated in that terrible assassination attempt. Well, as a result of that, of course, everyone in the U.S. was like, "What? There was an assassination attempt close to the White House, 15 blocks from the White House? Who did this? We have to get on it." Well, for 2 years, there's a search, a very intensive search to bring people to justice, and eventually, through the work of many investigative people and those who have written the book, John Dingus and Saul Landau, that track the story of this. It was brought to light. They had 2 photographs in 1978. They showed them in the Chilean newspapers and in the US newspapers. And they asked, "Can anyone identify these men?" And rather quickly, it was known that one of them was Michael Townley. And Michael Townley had been, as he was the person who led the raids at all the religious houses on November 1st and 2nd. And then he was also working with the DINA and led and actually planned and executed the assassination of Letelier in Washington, D.C.
Let me, there's a lot to get in here still, but why don't we go to your time at the U.S. consulate? Just very briefly tell us what happened and then your decision to leave.
Well, during that period of time, they picked me up on November 2nd, on that morning when they blindfolded me and took me to where Sheila Cassidy was. But eventually, they just dropped me off in front of my house again, which was incredible. But at that point, everyone I knew had fled. I had no money, no, just the clothes that I was wearing. And I didn't know where to go because any place I could go, I might compromise someone else. So it was a very scary time for me. But when I got back to the house, I ran into the church next door. And it just so happened that my housemate, Rosita, and Sister Paula had not left yet. And they were inside the church for protection. And they were on the phone. Sister Paula was on the phone with the U.S. Embassy giving details about my arrest. So we all immediately went into hiding for about 3 weeks. We were jumping in and out. People were offering, the strange thing was the sisters had been offering shelter over the last year and a half to so many Chileans who were endangered. But now it was us. We're having to ask other people, "Will you take us in?" And we were, obviously, it was very high profile and very dangerous for people who were taking us in. So I was on that side too. Various convents and various private homes, people's in private homes had me sleep there. It was very moving to be received in that way and with so much danger. But after 3 weeks or so, it was obvious that we were going to have to go through the U.S. Embassy and leave the country. When I was at the embassy, I was thinking about all the events that had happened. And it was a strange thing. They did not have accommodations for anyone they kind of fixed up accommodations for us very quickly. And so there were 2 twin beds and a little room and a nightstand where we stayed, but there was no washroom on the floor where we stayed. So at night, the Marine Guards would take us up into the consulate on the 3rd floor where they had some showers. And so we would shower there. One of us would shower and then the other one would shower, but the Marines would sit there watching us because it was a big conference space where they were making decisions about things, and we could look at the blackboard and see people's names and kind of wonder what was going on. But also in the back corner of this room, of this big room, was a door that said DEA above it. And I assumed that was the Department of Drug Enforcement. Anyway, there was a highly secured door. And in my reading and putting pieces together, I learned these many years later that definitely I had a strong sense of this evil coming from that door. And it reminded me of that man who was interrogating me. I was like, there has to be some connection here. And all of a sudden, reading, I learned that at the time of the coup, Pinochet, as a thank you gift to the US government, rounded up all of the drug lords at different selling sites, that were around the country. And I guess there was a plane load of drug operators that Pinochet gave to the US so that the US could claim that they've done something and prosecuted them. But then what did Pinochet do? He and his head of the secret police put their guys in charge of all of those drug transport sites. And through the money that they made doing that, they were able to have a big slush fund to operate the secret police.
Kathy, let me ask you, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to fire this at you. Please share with us how this experience maybe shaped your faith, and why did you decide to write the book 50 years later?
Well, the interesting thing is, when I was finally able to leave Chile, I didn't go home. I went to Peru because I felt if I went home to South Bend, I'd tell my story once, everyone would yawn, and it would just be like over. And I had gone to Chile for 2 years because I really wanted to learn the reality in Latin America. So I was lucky enough to go to where some of our other Notre Dame students were working in Chimbote, Peru. And I was able to get another volunteer position for the rest of 1976. So I did stay in Peru. I lived with a family, taught in another school. And it was a very rich experience living in one of the poorest neighborhoods where we had no water, open sewage, no electricity. So it was experiencing that life very much firsthand with the family and the neighborhood. So it was a very rich experience. I always wanted to write the book from the time of the experience because I felt that these women I lived with and the other people I met through them were extraordinary. They had an extraordinary audacity. They had an extraordinary commitment to save the lives of others, and they repeatedly were risking their lives to give others shelter in this situation in Chile where there was no justice in Chile. There was no recourse in Chile. And they weren't alone. Vast sectors of the church, Protestant and Catholic, were doing similar things. And so the cardinal at that time was also a wonderful person. He said that what the nuns was doing and the priests were doing in sheltering these people who were targeted, the Mir, he said they were showing indiscriminate mercy. And the work of the Comité Pro Paz, human rights work, and the work of the later Vicariate of Solidarity, because Pinochet made Cardinal Silva close the Comité Pro Paz, but then the Cardinal reopened it under his own auspices. So the work went on for the whole 17 years, and even after the 17 years of the Pinochet dictatorship, the work of the church continued at this very high level to bring back the democracy in Chile. And all of this, I think, is just, as we saw these same similar stories unfolding throughout Latin America, and then, of course, Central America in the 80s. It was all about the US destabilizing these countries and enabling very dictator governments, very unjust governments, and repressing the people's own desires to bring about certain changes in their countries. So the Chile story was the pivotal story that launched a lot of the other solidarity work to come.
Well, there's a lot of good work going on. There's a lot more to tell about this story. And I did want to talk to you a little bit about maybe the Catholic Church today, both here and abroad. But we'll save that for another time. The book is really wonderful. I Surrender, a memoir of Chile's dictatorship in '75. Real briefly, how did you choose the title?
I thought through it, and I thought the key moment was the moment where I was taken prisoner. I thought I would be killed, instantly tortured, then killed. And I was just like, well, it's in your hands now, God. And luckily, I lived to see another few days and decades. So I'm here, and I wanted the story and the bravery of all the people I met to be known.
We're really glad you're here. And the book is published by Orbis Books. That's run by Robert Ellsberg, the son of Daniel. It's really a good read. People will find it. And I'm so glad you came on to share the story with us. It's pretty harrowing, the things you went through. I want to invite you back. So think about that and we'll set it up. And I
Okay.
want to thank everybody who tuned in today, whether you're viewing or listening. I want to thank Lynn Orman, Katie Hogan, Tom Clark, our producers. I want to thank our engineer, Hal James. And I want to thank you all for being out there doing good in the world, because the world needs all the good that you do, that I do, that Kathy does. All of us together, we can make a difference.